Right, thank you. Fortunately, it's not a very tall podium because I tend to move a lot. So, do we have somebody who knows first aid? Yeah. Okay, we're covered. We're covered. No, thank you to OWASP and thank you to Exact for hosting the event. And thank you all for taking the time to come to the presentations. I hope it's not going to be extremely boring. But if you like movies, you'll enjoy this one because I do spend way too much time watching movies, so you'll see quite a few references. And if you get at least half of the movie references, then you're good. But let's see, where's the clicker? So a few words about myself, just the first half hour. My name is Sebastian Avarvarei. Been in IT for way more than 20 years. And as I put it there, I love to learn from my mistakes, and of course, I had a lot of learning opportunities. This is how you get on stage. And one of the things that started to preoccupy me a few years ago is contracts, and how do we put security in the contracts? And it started by realizing, and I think most of you know this picture is from XKCD. It's quite a good illustration of how software development works and how our infrastructure relies on a small piece of code that somebody put together years ago. And I realized that we have pretty much the same problem in contracts. Because in most contracts that I was seeing, and I still see, what we cover is just a very small piece from what we should be covering. Because the people writing the contracts often don't speak with the people who have the technical knowledge and understand the risks and what needs to be addressed, then they just put what is most obvious, but it leaves a lot of open areas. And this led me to the first talk that I gave in 2018 in Tokyo at Code Blue about the decalogue of the contractual security scenes. I won't bore you with the whole list here, but if you're interested in that talk and the details from that time, you have my contact details there. Feel free to reach out. But coming about contracts and application security in contracts, what we often see, and one of the first issues I had with the contracts, nobody actually reads them. And it's funny because, especially nowadays, nobody develops their own software except Exact, who develops it for others. But most companies rely on somebody else to do their software. There are so many interdependencies, and yet if you ask the technical teams who are actually doing the work, do you know what's in the contract that governs what you should be doing? Very few have actually did it, and even fewer have been involved in writing that contract. And of course, we don't need or want the entire development team to be part of the contract negotiation, but even as technical people, having a good understanding of what contracts are, what is the language used in the contracts, what is the impact of the language from the contracts on what we do, it's an important skill. And as we get a bit of an understanding of how do we put a contract together, we also get a better understanding of how to read those contracts. And another good reason to think about contracts and to try to get them right from the beginning is changing contracts is much harder than changing code. It's really a fight. Once a contract is signed, getting the lawyers again to agree on a contract change is difficult. And it's important to do it right because in the context of security and application security, if you think about it, it's just another aspect of the services that we deliver. Security is a quality aspect, just like any other. So you want to be explicit in the contracts how good my deliverables should be. My security should be about this big, or you need to be explicit. Just as you say, I want my car to have this specs, I want whatever machine I'm delivering, I want it to have it at this quality standard. We have to do the same with the security requirements. And yeah, as I said, this means that we need as technical people to get involved a little bit in the contract negotiations, in the writing of the contract, in helping our legal teams to put together some good templates that they can use in the contracts. And it's also very important to write good contracts because everything starts with good in every partnership. But things can go wrong. I mean, remember what happened with Anakin? Well, if he would have made some better contracts with the Jedi Council. But really, contracts is not something that you can easily change. And contracts don't have patch Tuesdays. You cannot go every week, oh, I thought about another problem. Can we release a new version of this contract? No. And if you look at how much the lawyers are being paid, you might understand why. But I digress. There's no patch Tuesdays for contracts. You have to think up front. So how do you do it? Especially looking at our domain, at application security. How do we know what kind of clauses do we need to put in the contracts? How do we know what good looks like? Well, one way to do it is, get some time-traveling wizard to help you. But that's actually not impossible. And many of you are actually doing this on a regular basis because you do threat modeling. And what is threat modeling other than looking into the future and thinking, what could go wrong? The only difference is, with the contract, you use a different language, a different format, but it's the same principle. You're thinking about what could go wrong, what are the risks, what are the threats you're trying to mitigate, and then what do I need to put in the contract? What do I need to write in there to mitigate those risks? Just threat modeling. And I actually encourage people to take the same approach, and you can use any threat modeling framework you want, Stride, Pasta, use any tool you're comfortable with, and you can actually model the threats and the topics you want to cover in a contract. And that would be a very interesting exercise to do together with your commercial teams, together with your procurement and legal. They might learn something about your way of working, so it's a really good building exercise. And you have to, of course, start thinking what is a good clause, based on that threat model, what threats to consider and wording, which brings to the next question. What is a good security clause? How do you write it? It's, again, not very complicated. It's not very different from the rules you have on writing software. For example, the first criteria is you have to ask for things that are doable. You should put in the contract requirements which are achievable. It has to be provable as well. No point in putting in contract something that you cannot check if it's actually being done or not. If you cannot check it, then it makes no difference if it has been done or not. And it has to be useful. It has to solve a problem. So these are the very simple 3 criteria that make a good security clause. And what I'm going to do in this presentation, I'm not going to give you a whole list of them. You need to have clause A, B, C, D. I'm not going to write contracts because I cannot write every possible type of contract because each threat model for each company will be different. But what I'm trying to provide here is a way of thinking and a bridging between what you know and how to apply it to this work. So let's take a scenario. Let's see how those 3 rules would apply to, let's take a threat of security vulnerabilities. Of course, depending on which side of the contract you are, either as a supplier, you want to make sure that your code is of good quality, or as a customer, you want to make sure that the code that you're receiving is secure. You don't want to have security vulnerabilities in the code. how do you write that in the contract? Let's take a few examples. One way is writing something like, the supplier's code must be free of any security vulnerabilities. That'd be nice to be achievable. But is it really feasible? Can you write code with zero defect? Yeah, no. Is it provable? Can you actually prove? No, there's no test that will give you each and every possible issue. So that's not a good clause. Could also write, the supplier must do its utmost to ensure the code is free of vulnerabilities. And trust me, I've seen contracts with this kind of language. The supplier will do its best to do whatever. How do you prove that you've done your best? How do you measure your best? No. You might say, well, let's get well-paid developers to do things. And say, the supplier must pay its developers well. Is that useful? Well, it is for the developers. But is it useful to achieve and to mitigate the threat that we listed? Not really. So, how could we actually write it? Well, you could put things like, the supplier must perform regular pen tests and share the pen test reports. Well, now that's more actionable. You actually say what you want, and it's something that can be provable, it's something that's useful. You could also be even more specific about the kind of activities, the kind of controls you want your supplier to have in their SDLC. You must use SAST and DAST, for example, or any other type of security control you want to put in place. You can even change requirements. You can say you must have those controls, and you shouldn't be deploying to production any code that has critical and high findings, for example. And you can use them in separation, you can use them together, but you are becoming more specific. It's clear what needs to be done. It's provable. Well, show me your report. Okay. Do I see any critical findings? No. Okay. Then you fulfill your contractual obligation. And while you're not able to eliminate the security vulnerabilities, at least you took care of the most impactful one. So that's one way of looking at the security clauses and how do you write good ones. Also, as you noticed from the previous example, you can skin a cat in multiple ways. You can write security clauses in different ways. And you usually have three big approaches. You can have it results focused. You can say, this is what I want to get. You can have it approach focused. This is what I want you to do because this guarantees that I'm getting what I want. Or evidence focused. This is the kind of proof you should be providing so I can be sure that you've done what I want. So what does this mean in practice? So let's take another threat. We, as a customer, we are concerned that maybe the developers working on our applications are not that well trained in security. So we say, we want the supplier to ensure that the developers working on customers' projects have adequate AppSec knowledge. Maybe it's not the most provable, what is adequate, but you state what you want. So this is a what approach. You can be specific about the method. How do we want those developers to have good security knowledge? Say, well, you shall organize yearly application security training for your developers, and this gives you even a better way of ensuring that the developers have that knowledge. You can combine them. So using an evidence-based approach. Say not only that you shall organize the trainings, but you shall share with me as a customer, what are you putting in those trainings? having a training in the latest game, it's not necessarily an application security training. But what's in your training curriculum? What kind of topics do you cover? And how do I know that the people in your company are actually following those trainings? Well, by sharing the attendance curriculum. And I've actually done this in previous organization, and it's quite effective. Or, by the way, you could ask them to come to OWASP chapter meeting events. That's another requirement you might. But if you put it in there, don't blame it on me. Okay, the OWASP organizers are supporting this. So, but these are the different ways in which you can achieve that. Let's take another example. We want our suppliers to be secure also in their infrastructure, and it might seem superfluous. I've lost track how many major incidents I've been involved in, incidents that were caused by breaches in the company's supply chain. And you want to make sure that your suppliers have some decent level of security, so you are protected from that angle. Especially if you look nowadays, even if you don't have necessarily VPN access of the suppliers in your network, they do have access to so much of your data, so much of your applications, that you need to have that coverage. So you can say, well, the supplier's infrastructure must be resilient against security attacks. So this is what you want to achieve. You can be specific about the methods, like requiring vulnerability management or any other types of controls that can ensure the security and the resilience of the infrastructure. Or you can ask for evidence. Again, you shall do pen tests with this frequency, and you have to share with me as a customer your pen test results, your SOC 2 reports, or whatever third-party attestation you have, so I have some level of assurance. Again, what, how, or evidence-based proof, and also they can be combined together. And you see, this is really threat modeling. That's the threat. These are the kind of controls and the kind of clauses. Nothing magic, nothing weird about it. Well, it gets weird when you get to the actual language, but that's why you work with the legal team. So these are a few examples of how to think about security clauses. I would also like to share some of my pet peeves when it comes to contracts. Some of the things that I've seen over and over again going wrong with the contracts. So one of my favorites is the phantom clause menace, which is the supplier shall follow the customer security policies. You see that in most contracts. Everybody has that, almost everybody, and almost everybody stops at it. That's all they put in there. So why is this a phantom clause? Has anybody read those policies? Again, no. Even if they read the contracts, it's actually extremely rare that during those contracts somebody goes to the policies and goes through them because they are big. Yeah, I know. But you might get surprises. Those security policies, which have now become part of the contract, so they are contractual obligations, might require you to work in a certain way, to have certain kind of technologies. You don't know what's going to be the impact of that until you actually read them. And not only that we don't read the policies, we're not prepared to deal with what happens when they change. Who picks up the bill? Because, yes, we should be updating our security policies on a regular basis. Most companies have some kind of requirement to at least review, if not update, the security policies on a yearly basis. And you should be doing that because the threat landscape changes, you get more mature in your processes, you become more strict in what your policies are requiring. But what do you do then? You really should think about how to deal with that change. Put something in the contract acknowledging that policies will change, and we need to have a process to deal with that. We need to talk about money, because even the analysis of those changes costs time, and time is money. And there might be financial implications from the changes. You want me to change some algorithm, you want me to change the encryption systems, all that costs money. Who is going to pay for it? If you don't specify that, you might end up as a supplier maybe in a situation where, well, I signed that I have to be compliant with the policies, I have to take over the cost of those changes, and that kills my business case for that deal. I've seen it happening. I think one of the examples I ran into a few years ago where the company changed its policies to require very extensive documentation as part of their change management process for the core IT systems. The company that was doing that maintenance all of a sudden had to do 3 times more work, to spend 3 times more hours on the same changes. That contract became a loss generating. They had to get out of that contract because they couldn't keep up with the costs. And any policy change can lead to that. And speaking of change, upgrades, patches, I have seen very few contracts who talk about that. How do you deal with updates to the applications? Who's responsible for which part? And let's go back to the first picture again. And remember, you have the whole stack, and what the contracts do, they usually have some statement about the application, like the supplier shall maintain the application up to date and apply the patches. You have the operating system, usually the customer provides that, or depending on the contract, somebody is responsible for the operating system. Well, I think you see where this is going. How about all the stuff in between? We have no idea. And don't quote me on the actual technologies. I didn't put them in any particular order. But remember, nowadays, between application and operating system, you have so many components from all the JavaScript libraries that you put in any web project, from the web server, the programming language, the PHP or the .NET libraries. Who is keeping that up to date? And when we realize that it's a problem? When we're in the middle of the crisis. Again, we work in security. I do a lot of incident response, or there's in vulnerability management, there's a new 0-day, have a log4 shell. What fun it is to figure out when you have to patch right now, to find out that you don't know who is actually responsible for those libraries. Who is actually responsible for keeping log4j up to date? And watch the blaming game beginning, and watch each part is saying, no, but it's part of the operating system. No, it's not operating system. It's part of your application. No, my application is the code that I write. That's why you need to think about this in the beginning. You need to define what the hell is an application. I mean, people writing contracts for software development still, in many cases, think like 20 years ago, you had one floppy disk with this is the application, this is the code, all done. We're not in that world anymore. The boundaries of an application are blurry at best. We need to find a way to put that into the contract, at least be specific. This is what I deliver. This is where my application ends, and this is where my responsibility ends. And this is also what I need you from the infrastructure to provide. Because, again, it kills me, and I'm sure many of you have been in the same position. You want to update an application, you have your team ready to do the rollout with the latest framework, with the latest patches, and the infrastructure cannot be upgraded because I don't know what kind of dependency with some legacy system. So say, okay, can I take a risk waiver on this? Because I'm going to update this application to maybe in 2 years from now. we need to think about these implications. And another thing to think about is best practices, another of my pet peeves. We see this in many contracts. The supplier shall follow the best practices. What is a best practice? Nobody can define that. And it's not, trust me, it's not a theoretical issue. I've been in a situation where there was a contract that says, well, you shall use best practice for encryption. It was I think firewalls or some kind of encryption hardware that they were delivering. And because there was no clarity on what is best practice, at the time it was 1024-bit versus, they had to redo the whole contract because the definition of best practice was not clear between the parties. And it's a shame, because we have real best practices that we can refer to. I mean, just OWASP, we have so many. You have the ASVS, you have the secure coding practices checklist, you have the SAM, the application maturity framework. There are many best practices that we could reference. If we really want to have best practices, let's name them. Put in the contract, the supplier shall follow this standard. The application should be at ASVS level 2. We can be specific. We don't have to use vague words just because we don't know any better. Because we do. We just need to get in touch with the people writing those contracts and tell them that this is what a best practice looks like. By the way, I have no idea how I'm doing on time. Okay. And talking about testing, and that's something that I have a lot of fun with, and especially when I was working more on the development side. And of course, everybody wants to do audits and tests, and now I'm looking more from the supplier side. But yeah, the customers want to have some assurance, and as we discussed earlier, we should have some assurance about the quality of the security that we deliver in the applications. But just saying, well, we shall do some audits and pen tests, that's not good enough, because there can be problems. So you need to be specific about what do you allow. How often are you allowed to do a pen test? Can I kill your production environment with a pen test every day? Maybe not the best idea. And also, how much time as a supplier should I be putting for free in supporting your pen test? Because when the customer does a pen test, well, you have to receive the report, read the report, spend time with developers to go through the findings. Again, it's time, it's money. How much do you actually allocate for that? And if the need goes over, how do you charge it? Also, what actually is allowed to be tested? Can you do pen test in production? Should you only do pen test in development? What should you do with who should be doing the pen test? Should it be independent third party? Can you use the internal security team? And by the way, with the production versus development, again, true story. A company was selling legal software, and they agreed with one of the prospective customers that they will let a third-party company to do a pen test in the dev environment to see how solid the software is. The pen test starts, and the pen tester actually finds quite a few vulnerabilities and is able to get in. That was not the problem. The problem was that by accident, somebody sent the connection details for the production environment. And the pen tester, because they thought that they are in the dev environment, they said, well, I'm not just going to find things, I'm going to show what data can I extract from the environment. Those were real-life legal cases. I have a picture in my mind of the pen tester when they realized what are they looking at, just stepping slowly away from the... I haven't seen anything, no. That's why you need to be specific, and not only in the contract, but also when it's applied, and make sure that the people who are responsible for fulfilling the requirements from the contract know what's in there. Like, pay attention. We signed that we do the pen testing development. Be careful what link do you give them and which accounts. Also, what happens with the pen test reports? If you get, especially if you get third parties, can they just send the pen test report to anybody? Because those pen test reports, those assessments contain quite sensitive information about your applications. You want to put that in the contract. The fact that no, they are not allowed to share the pen test results without your consent. And of course, looking at the cloud environments, there are all kind of additional complexities because you're pen testing an environment which is not just yours or doesn't contain just your data. These are the kind of details that you have to think. And as I said, I'm not going to go through all of that. There's a lot of extra requirements that I can give you. I'll list a few more. But remember, it's about the way of thinking. It's about how do we take an approach to identify the risks we should be mitigating. But just to give a few ideas of things you should be considering when doing the threat model for your contract. As I mentioned, think about what kind of security controls, especially in the case of application security, what kind of security controls in the SDLC do you want to require in the contract, or which ones you can offer. So if you are on the supplier side, you can actually tell your customer, I commit that I'm going to provide you with this quality. It might even become a contractual advantage for your company. Very important. Put something in there about how do you handle incidents. When should you be notified as a system owner that a system or an application maintained by a supplier has had an incident? Don't just count on the legal requirements put there specifically, and be more explicit. You have to notify me the moment you hear about the incident. You have to come with the first findings within so many days. And also, something that I rarely see being done in the contract. How are you going to be involved in the incident response? Because it's not enough to be notified about an incident. I want you as a supplier of a piece of software that has been compromised to be part of the incident response activity. Or if you're doing your own internal incident response, I might ask in the contract that at least once every 3 days, you give me a status update. What's happening with that incident analysis? Again, depends on the criticality, so you have to do your own risk assessment, just like threat modeling, but you need to say, what do you need? Vulnerability management, I mentioned that already. How do you ensure that things are free of bugs, both the software, the infrastructure, what is being covered? So if I'm responsible for ensuring that a piece of the stack is up to date with the patching, what exactly is that? Up to what level in the technology stack do I need to go? Access management and permissions. Again, very few companies are doing the software completely independent. Especially if you have custom development, you give them access to your systems. What kind of access? Shouldn't everybody just get a local admin access? Well, that's going to make my security team happy. Security policies, as I said in the beginning. Which ones? What are the actual documents? Which versions? How do you handle the change? SBOMs. One of my favorites lately. The software bill of materials. And when we were dealing with Log4Shell and a few of the other vulnerabilities, how nice it would have been if all our suppliers would have given us their software bill of materials so we can see, okay, which ones are using what versions of this vulnerable library. But also think a few steps ahead. Just saying you shall have SBOMs for your applications might not be enough. You might need to be even more specific. Not only you have to have SBOMs, you have to keep them up to date. Because just having an SBOM at the beginning of the contract and discovering three years down the road that nobody updated it. Because, well, in the contract it said that I need to give you one when I sign the contract, not that I have to keep it up to date, and therefore it's useless now. And also, even if the supplier has S-bombs, do you know how to read it? Do you know where should they be sending it on your side? So it has to be useful, remember. If there's an S-bomb that nobody has access to from your side as a customer, it's not a very useful thing to have. Regulations, standards, certifications. Again, something you might want to cover, especially if you are in a regulated industry. You might say, yeah, we have to be compliant with this standard. Think about health insurance, for example, or in the financial world. What regulations should the suppliers be compliant with? And on the supplier side, make sure you actually read them. Funny story. Somebody was making an offer for managed security services for a bank in Switzerland. Beautiful contract. They were surprised that they were winning because they came such low with the price. We're revolutionizing the Swiss market. Yeah, because you didn't read the national standards, which said that certain type of services cannot be provided from outsourced locations. They have to be provided by people in Switzerland, which tend to be a little bit more expensive than people in nearshoring or offshoring locations. Understand the regulations which are in the contract. Same as with the security policies. Again, access to production. Which systems should the developers have access to? What kind of data? Well, we're developing software. It doesn't mean that all the developers should have access to production data, especially if it's some other company's data. Put something in the contract of how is that being governed. If you do need to have access to production data, how do you arrange that? Write it down. Logging. I work in security. I love logs. We don't get enough logs. And especially for application security, for custom developed applications, we rarely see requirements that I want your application to create logs that I can feed into my SIEM. It doesn't have to be sophisticated. At least log for me every time somebody logs in, logs out, buys something. Have an agreement about what are the critical events, and make sure that you deliver those in the log so I can monitor that application. Have you seen contracts telling you that you should be logging events with the applications you develop? Yeah, I guess no. Education and training. We joke about this, but yeah, I do want the suppliers to have a good level of security education for their staff. I want the developers who work on my applications to have at least a reasonable understanding of the OWASP top 10, of the basics of security, and at least to know where do I need to go to ask if I think I'm in danger zone. Auditing and pen testing, we covered that one. Data retention. Yeah, you do have access to the data. You give access to your company data. For how long? How long can I keep if I develop something for you and I get some test data? Where do I need to delete it? Copyright, intellectual property, and not in the least physical security. Because if I have some sensitive application and somebody can just walk into an office location and just pick up a laptop and run with it, especially if the disk is not encrypted, which sometimes still happens. Yeah, even physical security needs to be covered to some extent. So again, the list is far from exhaustive. That's a good one. I didn't put it here. I do have it in the other presentation that I mentioned. It's sorry. Yeah. The question was, how about liability? Oh, that's an interesting one, because liability is a very legal area, but you have to have some understanding. You need to understand what kind of issues can you be liable for. Liability means what can you be blamed for, and what might have to pay a penalty for something. And this is the part where you really need to get working with the legal team to define those clauses. They need to, it's where you really have to spend the time to explain to them the risk, and they're always willing to listen. From all the legal departments I work with, I never saw a case where I would go to them to explain a risk, a liability issue, and they wouldn't be willing to listen. And it gets even more interesting when you couple it to cyber insurance. What are the things that can be insured? What liabilities can be transferred? That's a very changing market as well. That might be an interesting talk in itself, the cyber insurance. But yeah, liability, cyber insurance, these are things that you might consider in the contract. I actually see some contracts nowadays beginning to demand for the suppliers to have cyber insurance. Because as a customer, I want to make sure that if my supplier gets ransomware, they have some way to recover. I need them to keep alive, because otherwise my business, which is dependent on them, might go under as well. So yeah, as I said, this is pretty much the list that I put together. You have to work on your own. You have to see, some of them might not be relevant, but at least now you understand the way of thinking, and you can see no more. Questions?
The salsa standard and now recently the trusted supply chain from Red Hat, because these things are trying to cover to some extent the whole idea of supply chain security more from a technical perspective, but they are still, still will not be baked into the contract to some extent.
So your salsa standard, I'm actually not familiar with that one. I'll have to look it up.
Something that Google invented for a school. The supply chain levels for software attacks. It's that's the
yeah.
interplay of S-bombs plus core sign plus everything. But they are trying to come up with some standards lately, like some sort of degree of kind of auditable things for us.
So I'm not familiar with it, but sounds like the kind of project that would be very useful. So it's if I understand correctly, it's a framework for supply chain security focused on one application software. What is the name again?
Salsa, S-L-S-A.
Salsa, like the food or the dance. Okay, I'll see. You learn every day. You learn something, even here on stage. So yeah, I'll definitely look it up, and it's something that I was wondering if to put in the presentation or not, but I didn't want to overcommit. But it might also be an idea for an OWASP project, and I'm going to put my hand up. I don't know if I'm going to actually have the time to do it, but as we have so many resources from OWASP, that would be maybe a useful one as well, to have some kind of framework with some templates and maybe even some threat models of clauses that you can quickly select, maybe with some buttons. Okay, I have this problem. Okay, give me the basic security requirements that I should put in the contract. Take that to the procurement team and work with them. So yeah, it's for sure an area that will need more formalization. Yeah. Okay, so I have the first one. All right. So go ahead.
So, how do you deal with a bunch of wafers? What does the contract work if you deal with a lot of wafers?
If I deal with what kind of waivers?
Security wafers, some liability waivers, sign, maybe some S-bombs,
Yeah, those would be case-by-case decisions. So the question was, how do you deal with waivers, like risk waivers? Yeah, not only customers, the internal customers then do the same. Oh, we cannot patch this. Oh, can I just raise a risk waiver? Yeah, I know. Yeah, depending on the volume, if you have to keep track of them. You need to have some system for managing these waivers. And unfortunately, there aren't many good. I've actually been looking for this kind of software. I've seen a few, but at the end of the day, a good Excel tracker or some we actually use something developed in Microsoft Forms. But if you need two things. One is a way for the waivers to be submitted, and then something to get them through an approval process. So at least, okay, we have the waivers, but it's not, the software engineer signing off on the waiver, because we don't want the software engineers to be liable for big contractual stuff. You want to be sure that at least the risk waivers are signed off from the right level of management, because that's why the managers are paid the big bucks. So we put our names there, and it's our responsibility, not the people in our teams. But yeah, it's something that it's usually done in-house with some custom developed tools.
It's not necessarily something that I see for specifically managing waivers, but now with the kind of trends that I have seen, for example, in Kubernetes a lot or in cloud-native security is using policy as code, basically. So things like Open Policy Agent or Kyverno for Kubernetes. And basically what happens is that you have a bunch of policies that are written high level by managers, and they get translated into the language because it's a declarative language, so you can translate it. And then there are tools that allow you to monitor at least compliance and non-compliance to a certain extent, and that can help a little bit with managing waiverings to some extent, but I'm guessing that it gets more complicated than that.
Yeah, so that's one way to do it, but it's a bit of a niche case. It's for that niche, it's very useful and very powerful because policy as code, but it doesn't cover all the situations and all the kind of risk waivers you get. Sorry, you had one more question in the back.
It sounds pretty great if you have just sliders and things where you can choose whether, like, what policies you want and whatever, but do you have some sort of a template everyone can just use and see, okay, am I following these good practices?
That's the project.
Yeah, that would be the project. So the question is, and it's not something that I have ready-made, and it wouldn't be from the beginning usable for each and every situation. But I do have, for example, internally, we have some contract templates that we are right now updating with our legal team to put this kind of requirement in there. So it becomes an internal library. But yeah, maybe we'll get a WASP project going.
Could you open source those internal things? Because that would pretty much already solve it, right?
I'll get you a meeting with my legal team and. Legal saying no, that never happens. All right, and I think that's my cue for the time. Thank you very much again, and if you have more questions, that's where you can find me.